The Mega Drive is probably the only console in the history of gaming that I've played enough games on to feel even slightly comfortable making a top 10 list. It wasn't my first console, that was the Master System, but it was the one I spent the largest amount of time on in my most formative years, and it's one I've returned to often in the decades since. As I said in a recent video, nostalgia is a drug that wears off over time, but my nostalgia for the Mega Drive and its games is so strong that a good deal of it still remains, running through my veins with a fervour that has perhaps diminished over the years, but is far from extinguished. And while I haven't played every Mega Drive game, not by a long shot, I've played the vast majority of the titles that are considered important or historically significant. So while it's quite possible there are a few hidden gems out there that I haven't considered for this list, hopefully I've got a reasonable overview of what the console had to offer. Now, I do firmly believe that every game on this list is objectively pretty damn good, but of course there's a lot of subjectivity involved too. I have no doubt your list will be different. Let me know what you changed, and also let me know if you think there are any really obscure games I might not have played that I should have considered. Anyway, starting at number 10. Gauntlet 4 is not just an arcade conversion of an excellent game, although it's that too. I remember reading somewhere that the 4 in the title is not a sequel number, although as far as I can tell it was actually the 4th in the series. Rather, it refers to the fact that there are 4 game modes in this version. Whether it's true or not, the 4 different modes were a worthy addition and added a great deal to the game. The arcade mode is exactly what you'd expect. Pick a character, advance through the levels killing enemies, collecting keys and treasures, and shooting food just as your friend was about to eat it. But the quest mode is where the real meat of the game is, and it's where I spent the majority of my time with the game. This mode gives you a set of 4 dungeons which can be tackled in any order and which contain some devious puzzles and navigation challenges, as well as a standard array of enemies and items. There are also RPG elements, and remember this is from the era decades before we all got tired of games having meaningless leveling systems and experience points. Well, I say we all got tired of it. I personally am still a sucker for making arbitrary numbers go up. There's also a deathmatch mode and a kind of single player mode with a password system, but it was the quest mode that made the game what it was. It really was a meaty action-adventure ordeal. Gauntlet 4 also did some remarkable things with the Mega Drive's sound capabilities. The music is truly excellent, by turns epic and creepy, and the digitized speech seemed like a technical miracle at the time. I used to spend ages in the sound test mode playing all the different speech samples. That must sound ridiculous to anyone under the age of 30, but it was just so impressive for the time, as was the rest of the game. Okay, entry number 9. Populous 2 was quite unlike anything else on the Mega Drive. Well, okay, the first Populous did also appear on the Mega Drive and was quite similar, but Populous 2 was bigger and better in every way. I did actually own the original Populous on my PC, but it was barely playable on my hunk of junk, and I suspect I was too young to understand what was going on anyway. But by the time the sequel made it to the Mega Drive, I was ready to give it a proper go, and I ended up absolutely loving it. It was the visual element that appealed to me at first, the way the game was presented to you. You peer down upon the world like a god, and indeed, that is what you are in Populous. I just liked watching the little guys wander around, building their small settlements, spreading out over the map, exploring new areas. It's honestly very much the same sort of reason I spend so much time on Google Maps. I just like looking down on the world, seeing what I can see. But you're not just a passive observer in this game. You've got to lead your people to victory over the followers of your divine rival. To do this, you need to use your godly powers to carve out space for their cities to grow and flourish, which I always really enjoyed. Not having access to SimCity, this was the closest I could get to a proper city building game. Of course, you can also use your powers to smite the infidels, which is also a hell of a lot of fun. There are a whole heap of divine interventions to use in this game, as you summon lightning storms or cause swamps to spring up or whirlpools to devour your opponent's lands. My favourites are always the fire abilities, because who doesn't like raining fire down on their foes? And in this game you can do it in the most literal sense. The longevity of this game was massive for the time, and the challenge ramped up significantly in later maps, as did the fun and the chaos as you unlocked more and more abilities. If you were into this sort of thing, and I definitely was, Populous 2 was one of the best value games on the Mega Drive. Right, number 8. Cannon Fodder is an amazing game, but at this point you may be wondering if this is a list of the top 10 Mega Drive games, or just a list of games where you watch a bunch of small guys running around on the screen. And it's true, this is another game with a top-down perspective and a bunch of tiny sprites. That's not entirely a coincidence. The Mega Drive had a huge range of platformers and scrolling shooters and beat-em-ups, and many of them were great, but the sheer number of them meant that games which took a different approach tended to stand out. Populous 2 is a great example of this, a type of game which might have seemed more at home on a PC or Amiga, but which still turned out great on the Mega Drive. And like Populous, Cannon Fodder is all about guiding your little guys to victory in warfare, but whereas Populous let you guide a civilization, Cannon Fodder requires you to get right down to micromanagement. You have direct control of a small squad of soldiers, guiding them through a series of battlefields that rapidly increase in complexity and danger. It's a surprisingly hardcore game, as all the combatants are realistically fragile and an entire squad can be eliminated in a second or two. And once a soldier is gone, they're gone for good. You get new recruits as the game progresses, but your pool of soldiers is ultimately limited, so you really want to do your best to help your men survive. Apart from anything else, it's very easy to get emotionally attached to your little guys, and seeing a soldier you've led through many difficult sorties lying on the ground, screaming in pain as he slowly slips into the void, can be devastating, even if they are just a small pile of pixels. It's almost a puzzle game as much as it's a strategy or action one, as you have to figure out how to use the battlefield and the resources at your disposal to overcome some truly nasty challenges. It can honestly get frustrating, but it's such a well-crafted and enjoyable game that it easily earns a place on this list. Okay, on to number 7. I've already made a whole video on Landstalker, so I won't go into the specifics here. If you want to hear some more of my thoughts on why this is one of the best games on the Mega Drive, I'll provide a link to that video below. The main thing that comes to mind when I think of Landstalker these days is just how well crafted and how highly polished the entire game is. I don't think the concept of a AAA game was really a thing back then, and certainly game budgets were not quite what they are these days, but by Mega Drive standards I would be happy to call Landstalker a AAA game. Not only is it well crafted, it's large and expansive, and well paced and well balanced, and just has a sheen of quality that was a cut above almost anything else. Nothing feels haphazard or half-assed, every corner of the world seems handcrafted and well thought out, and this is something that modern gamers may not appreciate. Sure, games today can be pretty hit or miss in terms of quality, but back then design skills and standards were still developing, and even fundamentally good games often contained elements that just felt as though they'd been haphazardly thrown together with little concern for whether they'd actually be fun to play. That's not the case for Landstalker. Actually, it's not the case for any of the games on this list really, and that may be the most relevant common thread between them. Ultimately, Landstalker is an epic adventure that's still fun to play through even today. Next up, number 6. There was no way that a Sonic game wasn't going to pop up on this list at some point. I thought very hard about putting Sonic 3 and Knuckles on this spot, as I think it's reasonable to consider them as one game. But the fact is that back in the day, if you wanted to play it in full, you most definitely had to pay for 2 games. So instead, this spot goes to Sonic 2. The first Sonic the Hedgehog was a great game, iconic even, but the sequel just took everything to the next level and solidified Sonic as one of the definitive platformer game series of the 16-bit era. You probably already know why. It's fast, it's smooth, it's flat out fun, and the soundtrack is an all-time classic. I've mentioned before that I don't think Sonic games have necessarily aged as well as Mario and some other Nintendo icons. They're just a tad shallow and unsophisticated compared to the most enduring platform legends. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, and back in the day Sonic was flashy and fast in a way that really captured the zeitgeist, not to mention the essence of the Mega Drive. As well as many distinctive levels that are both visually and aurally appealing, Sonic 2 contains my personal favourite special stages. These tunnels were technically impressive for the time, and I always found them a lot of fun. There's a very pleasing sense of inertia as you zoom around and around, and even today my muscle memory kicks in as I try to remember which blind corner or bump has bombs hidden behind them. Plus, Sonic 2 was the first time you got to play as Super Sonic, which felt like using a cheat code, but one that was sanctioned by the game designers. I always hated that it drowned out the stage music though. Anyway, there's not a lot I can really say about Sonic that hasn't been said a billion times before, so on to number 5. I've mentioned my love of Street Fighter 2 many times. In fact, in my last video I talked about stealing coins from my mother's purse to fuel my addiction to the arcade machine when I was a kid. And, okay, bit of a tangent here, sorry. Some guy posted this comment under that video. At first I was honestly baffled, and I wondered what the hell he was on about. It wasn't until my nephew reminded me that I thought about my confession of stealing loose change. It didn't occur to me at first because I really thought it was pretty innocuous stuff, stealing a few coins to play an arcade game. Plus I was pretty clear that I regretted it, and I'd been caught and punished by my mother. I figured I'd paid my debt to society. But this guy apparently thinks that my crimes merit at least the title of Snake and the punishment of no one ever watching my YouTube videos. Which seems like an overreaction to me. But then I started wondering, am I wrong about the smallness of my crimes? The guy is right, I did steal from my family. And like I said, we didn't have much money, so even the loss of loose change would have made my mother's life harder. Do I deserve to still be punished for this? Do I, more than 3 decades later, deserve to be shunned by the entire internet, or even by my friends and family? I think, and I hope, not. But hey, if you truly do think that this is a valid reason to curse my name and hit that unsubscribe button, I can't really argue with that. Right, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Street Fighter 2. I've also mentioned in the past that Street Fighter has somewhat fallen down my list of favourite fighting game series, but it was the first one I ever played and I do still think it's a great series, particularly with the advent of Street Fighter 6. The first Mega Drive version, the Special Champion Edition, was a huge game in a couple of ways. At 24 megabits, it was the largest Mega Drive game release up to that point. It was also incredibly expensive. It took me an eternity to save enough cash for it, but I still considered it an absolute bargain, given how much the arcade machine cost to play. And hey, it meant I no longer had to resort to crime to fund my addiction. Just kidding, my guilt had already set me on the straight and narrow. The thing that really set Street Fighter 2 apart from its competitors was its pure speed and replayability. I never tired of just beating the crap out of Ken and Guile and Chun-Li and all the other assorted martial arts weirdos. But of all the games on this list, it's probably the one whose position relies most on how I felt about it at the time, as opposed to how I feel about it now. If I want to play Street Fighter these days, I'd go with a newer version, and even hardcore fans who still play the older games in the series are unlikely to choose the Mega Drive version. But it was a colossal achievement to have such an important game on the system, and my sheer excitement to be able to play it at home earns it a place on this list. Right, number 4, and it's Gunstar Heroes, another game that I've made a full video on. My second video ever, actually. It's almost as if this channel was mostly started as an excuse to talk about my favourite Mega Drive games. I wonder if the subject of my first ever video will show up on this list. Anyway, Gunstar Heroes is a game that simply reeks of quality. You can clearly see the amount of effort the developers put into it. And I don't mean that in a condescending, wow, you must have really tried hard sort of way. I mean that right from the first moment through to the very end, this game does everything it can to engage the player, to give them exciting action and compelling gameplay, and it does it so well. Every level is varied, and the game throws a whole heap of different gameplay elements and ideas at you. If done poorly, this could seem messy or confusing, but nothing about Gunstar Heroes is done poorly. Whether it's riding on minecarts, or flying through space, or just jumping around shooting dudes, it's a hell of a lot of fun. And the bosses, man, the bosses. This is where the creativity truly shines. There are so many of them, and they're almost all fantastic. I know it's not entirely fair to compare games across genres that are trying to create different experiences, but every time I play a Sonic game from the era, I think you could have taken a leaf out of Gunstar Heroes book and been a bit more ambitious with your bosses. Anyway, it's an undeniably great game. Go and watch my old video on it if you want to know more of my thoughts. Right, in third place. Okay, the order of the next two games is easily what I had to think about the most when compiling this list, and I'm still kind of undecided. In fact, as I write this sentence, I still don't know what game I'm about to talk about. Guess I need to decide. Okay, at number 3, it's Phantasy Star 4. The only reason it's at 3 and not one spot higher is simply because the game at number 2 is one I have stronger memories of actually playing at the time. But yeah, Phantasy Star 4. We didn't have Final Fantasy on Mega Drive, or indeed in Australia at that point, but the Phantasy Star series did a great deal to fill that gap. The earlier games in the series were kind of a mixed bag, although I'd say they all had a lot of merit. With the fourth game though, the series created a JRPG that did everything right. Epic in scope but with a highly polished presentation, lengthy and substantial but not packed with filler or frustrating dungeon crawls, it was an amazing adventure. The story didn't do anything too unexpected, but it was still exciting and compelling, and the characters weren't particularly deep and nuanced, but they were still interesting and well crafted, and particularly appealed to me at that age as I was just discovering the whole anime aesthetic. And I especially liked the setting with its mix of magic and sci-fi. Nowadays I might consider myself more of a sci-fi purist, as I like everything to have a logical explanation, but with a game like this I could still very easily suspend my disbelief and just go along with it. I think it really is the presentation that makes this game a standout on the Mega Drive. The music is fantastic, the artwork is a perfect example of the 16-bit JRPG style, and I particularly love the manga-esque illustration panels. Gameplay-wise it's fairly traditional but gives you plenty of tools to mess around with, and it sure as hell kept me hooked. Even today, it's an easy game to recommend to any fan of the genre. So, on to number 2. Shining Force 2 is another JRPG, which is largely why I struggled so much to decide whether to put it or Phantasy Star 4 in second place. It's a slightly different style though, being a strategy RPG, and although strategy RPGs have become a bit of a niche genre in modern times, back then I thought it was just about the coolest thing. I haven't done a video on Shining Force 2, but I did make one on the first game of the series a while back, and I loved that first game, but like Sonic 2, the sequel just ramped everything up to another level. The battles were better balanced, the narrative was wide-ranging enough to give the world a sense of scale, but focused enough to create a compelling narrative, and the world was relatively open by the standards of the day and a lot of fun to explore. There were quite a few secrets to uncover, including hidden characters, which gave the whole game a sense of promise and excitement. I think it's this more than anything else that nudges Shining Force 2 one spot higher than Phantasy Star 4 on this list, just that sense that you never knew what you might find if you looked a bit harder. And that strategy-based gameplay might be a factor too. Shining Force 2 wasn't a particularly challenging game and it didn't require you to get your head around massively complicated systems, and frankly that's fine by me. I don't usually want to be expending too much of my limited brain power, and the fact you had a large squad at your command that you could move around the battlefield really appealed to me. Kind of the same appeal that Cannon Fodder held, except this is turn-based and therefore a lot less stressful. Both Shining Force 2 and Phantasy Star 4 were hugely influential for me and did a lot to help turn me into a lifelong JRPG fan. If you're not quite such a fan of the genre, you might not agree with their place on this list, but I think it's undeniable they are both fantastic examples of what the genre was capable of on the Mega Drive. Okay, before we get to number 1, a few honourable mentions. Jungle Strike was a massive dynamic shooter that I couldn't really put on this list because I found it too damn difficult. Streets of Rage 2 is arguably the most iconic entry in the series, and it is damn good. I just don't quite think that style of game has aged as well as others. Any number of sports games could have made this list, for example NBA Jam, something from the NBA Live series or the PGA Tour series, or maybe Sensible Soccer. And while I played all those games and greatly enjoyed them, they just don't live on quite so strongly in my memory. They're all fun, but they just don't create such meaningful experiences, for me at least. Lemmings remains my favourite puzzle game of all time, and the only reason it's not on this list is because... Actually, I can't think of a reason. I was going to say it's because it was better known on other systems, but hell, I've got other games on here that were definitely better known on other systems. And the Mega Drive Lemmings had great exclusive levels and easily the best version of the amazing soundtrack, in my opinion at least. Okay, this is now a top 11 list, with Lemmings slotting in at, let's say 5th place. And so, finally, at number 1 we have... Echo, the Tides of Time. And that won't be a real surprise to any long-time viewers, or indeed anyone who looked at the thumbnail of this video. It was the subject of my very first video and a major reason I wanted to start a YouTube channel at all. It's a pretty comprehensive look at the game, so you can watch that if you feel like hearing me waffle on about my favourite Mega Drive game for too many minutes. But if you just want to hear me waffle on about it for too many seconds, here we go. It's the atmosphere of Echo that gets to me, and the maturity of it. Those are two rather vague words to use when talking about games, but I really can't think of any better way to put it. Echo's world is dangerous, threatening, often dark, both literally and metaphorically, but it's also filled with great beauty and tantalizing mysteries. It tells a fantastical story, but it's grounded in reality. It has a unique setting and contains neither humans nor anthropomorphic animals. These animals are quite realistic. And the soundtrack is not just one of the best on the system, but one of the best of all time. So, yeah, I'm a fan. For me, Echo, the Tides of Time is the best game on the Mega Drive. Bet you didn't see that coming. Anyway, what did you think of my list? Am I a paragon of good taste, or the most ridiculous buffoon who ever dared to offer an opinion on the internet? Let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe, pray to the gods for my continuing health, etch my name into the foundations of a great stone structure so that one day I may be remembered for my mighty deeds. Write an op-ed piece for a national newspaper extolling my virtues. Name an island in the Caribbean after me. And most importantly, get off my lawn.